Mr. Speaker, as HDB flats primarily serve to meet the housing needs of flat owners and their family members, there is no limit imposed on the number of family members who can live together in an HDB flat. However, HDB imposes an occupancy cap on flats which are rented out to unrelated persons. This is to minimize the disamenities caused by overcrowding and to maintain a conducive living environment in our public housing estates. HDB reviews this occupancy cap from time to time to ensure that it remains relevant. Currently, the cap is 4 persons for 1- and 2-room flats, 6 persons for 3-room flats, and 9 persons for 4-room and larger flats. From 1st of May this year, the occupancy cap for 4-room and larger flats will be reduced to 6 persons in line with the rule for private residential properties. And these rules are published on the HDB info web. Appropriate action will be taken against the flat owners if the number of tenants exceed the occupancy cap.
Mr. Lewison.
Thank the Minister for the reply. Will the Minister consider using this maximum number of occupants allowed in a flat that's being rented out as the same criteria to be applied when a single unwed or a divorcee is considered whether they can live with their parents or family members as an alternative accommodation? I'm suggesting this as it would make sense if the family wanted to rent out their flat and they're not allowed to because they met the maximum number of occupant limits and would be considered overcrowded. Then surely this same family can't provide accommodation to their child or sibling who is single, unwed, or divorced.
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, the cap on flats is applied only for flats which are rented out to unrelated parties. There is presently no occupancy cap on families living together in their own HDB flats. And that should be the standard we apply similarly whether or not it's a family or it's a single unwed parent.
Mr. Lewison.
I've also asked the PQ about the minimum space standards, and can Minister clarify why we are not going to publish this minimum space standards? This is what's actually being done in the EU and Canada already.
Mr. Speaker, I think we should look at these in context and perspective. Different countries have different standards. Not all countries have a minimum space standard. And even those that do use these standards as guidelines, and these are not necessarily legislated in some of the countries that Mr. Ng mentioned. In Singapore's context, all of us know that space is limited, and we have to optimize space to the best of our abilities. What we do for HDB flats is we publish the size for the different flat typologies, 1- to 2-room size, 3-room, 4-room, all of different flat sizes. The floor space for each of these HDB unit types are made public, and families can choose which ones they would like to apply for.
Ms. Lee Bee-Wah, Engineer Lee Bee-Wah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask Minister, in the recent review or reduction of the number of people who can stay in a HDB flat, rented out, the same criteria was applied to those old jumbo flats, which consists of 1 4-room and 1 3-room combined, and it can only be leased out to 6 persons. I would like to ask Minister whether can Minister review this, because it is actually 2 units together, because we have residents from Nisun GRC requesting it, because we have some old jumbo flats. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. In fact, I vaguely recall, and I stand corrected if my memory is wrong, that we had an earlier debate on this under the Planning Act, and it was Engineer Lee herself. At that time, the HDB occupancy cap was still 964, but we had moved, or we were planning to move for private residential units to move it to 6. And Engineer Lee had passionately advocated for HDB to align its standards to the URA standard, which is 6. And this is what we have done. So Engineer Lee has now asked for more flexibility for the jumbo flats. I think we'll have to look at whether or not this is feasible. But we have aligned the standards between HDB and URA, and it's a standard of 6 for the larger flat types in the HDB case presently.
Mr. Lewison.
Just one last question. I think we talk about overcrowded, and I can't see a reason why whether a person is related or not would determine whether the place is overcrowded. If there's 9 people staying in there that is related, it would still be overcrowded, even if the 9 people were unrelated. So can Minister clarify why there's this point about whether they're related or not, in terms of deciding whether it's overcrowded?
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, we do not prescribe minimum standards of space for Singaporeans, families who purchase their own flats. You may be a family with 5 children, 3 children, 4 children. What flat type you wish to choose, it's entirely up to you. The different flat types are made available, there are generous grants given, and then you decide what flat you choose. And so that's, I think, a policy that has served us well and will remain. The standards, the occupancy standards apply for rental, and that rental that standard applies really to minimize overcrowdedness and to maintain the residential character of the HDB estate as one meant primarily for families to live and stay in. And that's why there is this occupancy cap, and it's applied to unrelated persons.